Greetings and welcome to the online meeting, Sylvia Ageloff and the Assassination of Leon Trotsky, featuring David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, and Eric London, a writer for the World Socialist website and author of the recently published essay on the subject of today's events. More than 80 years ago, on August 20th, 1940, Leon Trotsky, the exiled co-leader of the Russian Revolution and the founder of the Fourth International, was mortally wounded by an agent of the Stalinist GPU at his home in Coyoacán, a suburb of Mexico City. Trotsky died the following day in the early evening hours of August 21st. Trotsky, born in 1879, became a revolutionary at the age of 17. He was chairman of the St. Petersburg Soviet during the 1905 Russian Revolution. He was co-leader with Vladimir Lenin of the October Revolution of 1917. He was Soviet Russia's first Commissar of Foreign Affairs, and he was the founder and leader of the Red Army during the Civil War to defend the newly formed workers' state. Beginning in 1923, Trotsky led the left opposition, that is, the Marxist and internationalist opposition to the nationalist and bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union, personified by Stalin. The repudiation of socialist internationalism by the Stalinist bureaucracy required a campaign of historical falsification. This campaign was aimed at obliterating Trotsky's political influence and denying the connection between the perspective for which he fought and that which guided the Russian Revolution itself. Trotsky was expelled from the Russian Communist Party in November of 1927. He was exiled to the steppes of Central Asia and Alma-Ata, then part of the Soviet Union, in January of 1928. He was expelled from the Soviet Union to Turkey in 1929. He was forced to flee from Turkey to France in 1933. And from France, he was forced to flee to Norway in 1935. And then finally, in January of 1937, to Mexico, the only country in the world that would grant him a visa. There he took up residence in Coyoacán, a suburb of Mexico City. Even in exile, and despite the unimaginable personal and political hardships, Trotsky waged a fearless campaign to expose the crimes of Stalinism and its disastrous consequences for the international working class. His writings from this period, including his analysis of the rise of fascism in Germany and his exposure of the consequences of Stalinist Popular Front policies in France and Spain, are invaluable guides even 85 years later. Among his greatest works is The Revolution Betrayed, written in 1936, which remains the definitive analysis of the social and political origins of Stalinism. In 1938, Trotsky and his co-thinkers founded the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution, as the political embodiment of the irreconcilable antagonism between the Stalinist apparatus on the one hand and the Soviet and the international working class on the other. Terrified by the threat that Trotsky and the Fourth International represented, Stalin resorted to ever more brutal violence and repression. Within the Soviet Union, a campaign of political genocide was carried out between 1936 and 1939 against workers and intellectuals trained in the Marxist tradition, including all of Lenin's and Trotsky's closest collaborators. Hundreds of thousands of socialists, the product of an immense tradition of revolutionary culture in Russia, were massacred. The grotesque lie that the actions of the Stalinist bureaucracy were carried out in the interests of socialism had enormous consequences on the class consciousness of millions of workers throughout the world. The Stalinist GPU, the state secret police, worked systematically to physically liquidate Trotsky's closest supporters and co-thinkers. Among those murdered by Stalinist agents were Erwin Wolf, one of Trotsky's political secretaries in July of 1937, Ignaz Reis, who had defected from the GPU and declared his support for Trotsky in 1937, September of 1937, Trotsky's son and close collaborator Lev Sedov in February 1938, and Rudolf Clement, secretary of the Fourth International, who was kidnapped and murdered in July of 1938 on the very eve of the founding conference. His dismembered body was discovered in the River Seine in Paris. Trotsky wrote in 1938, after the assassination of Clement, now, quote, imperialism no longer has to depend on a happy accident. In the Stalinist mafia, it has a ready-made agency for the systematic murder of revolutionists. The terrible culmination of the bloody campaign to destroy Marxist opposition to the Stalinist bureaucracy came on August 20th, 1940, when an ice pick was driven into the head of Leon Trotsky. The hand that brought an end to the life of the greatest living strategist of world revolution was that of Ramon Mercader, aka Frank Jackson, aka Jacques Monard, an agent of the GPU. Despite the lying denials of the Soviet Stalinist regime, it was immediately assumed throughout the world that the assassin was a Stalinist agent. But for 35 years, little was known about the vast scale of the conspiracy and the network of agents utilized to carry it out. How was the GPU able to infiltrate the Trotskyist movement and assassinate its leader in a fortified villa in Coyoacán? In 1975, 35 years after Trotsky's assassination, the International Committee of the Fourth International launched the first systematic investigation into the assassination of Trotsky under the headline, Security of the Fourth International. The Security of the Fourth International investigation produced a series of revelations proving that the assassination of Trotsky and his supporters was orchestrated through a global network of spies and assassins who infiltrated the Trotskyist movement. These included Marx Borowski, who was the secretary of Trotsky's son, Lev Sedov, and who was central in the murder of Erwin Wolf, Ignaz Reis, Rudolf Clement, and Sedov himself. Joseph Hansen, who was a personal secretary to Trotsky in Mexico, a guard at the time of his assassination, and would go on to become the principal political leader of the Socialist Workers' Party. And Sylvia Ageloff, secretary for US Trotskyist leader James Cannon, working in the SWP Center in New York City. One unanswered question, however, in the investigation was the precise role of another Sylvia Ageloff, the personal companion of Ramon Mercader. She met Mercader in July of 1938 on the eve of the founding conference of the Fourth International. In the 2 years between that meeting and Trotsky's assassination, Ageloff was involved in every critical step by which Mercader was introduced to the Trotskyist movement, up to the point of infiltrating the house in Coyoacán and carrying out his bloody act. The role of Sylvia Ageloff is a subject of a new essay published on the World Socialist website by Eric London, Sylvia Ageloff and the Assassination of Leon Trotsky. The essay is the subject of today's meeting. I'm Joseph Castor, and I'll be co-moderating today's discussion. Joining me as well in co-moderating the event is Tom Mackaman, a historian at King's College in Pennsylvania and a contributor to the World Socialist website, who will introduce our panelists today. Tom?
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce today's speakers. David North is chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. He is the author and editor of many books on history and Marxism, including The Definitive History of the Fourth International, The Heritage We Defend, as well as In Defense of Leon Trotsky, which answers the historical falsifications of recent Trotsky biographers. Since 1975, David has played the leading role in Security in the Fourth International, the investigation organized by the International Committee of the Fourth International into the assassination of Trotsky and the infiltration of the Trotskyist movement by agents of the Soviet Union and the American state. Security in the Fourth International was the first and is still the only investigation of assassination into the assassination of the great revolutionary that's been carried out by the socialist movement. David's work exposed the network of agents, as Joe said, that carried out and covered up the assassination of Trotsky, as well as those of Sadov, Wolf, Clement, and Rice. His investigative work, too, took David to Mexico on 2 occasions where he met with leading figures involved in Mexico's own investigation of the assassination. And in the US, David tracked down the key conspirator in Sadov's assassination, Mark Zborowski, and helped bring to light secret meetings between Joseph Hansen, the longtime leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, and the FBI, contacts unknown to the SWP, and which were followed personally by J. Edgar Hoover, the vicious anti-communist head of the FBI. I'm also pleased to introduce Eric London, one of the leading writers for the World Socialist website. In recent years, Eric has done crucial work carrying forward the security in the Fourth International Investigation, including the series we are discussing today, which reveals SWP member Sylvia Ageloff to have been a co-conspirator with Trotsky's assassin, Ramon Mercader. This series involves extensive research, including into Spanish language sources. Eric is also the author of the book Agents, the FBI, and the GPU Infiltration of the Trotskyist Movement, which was published by Mering Books in 2019 and was based on archival research to shed new light on how the US and Soviet governments spied and infiltrated the world Trotskyist movement from the 1930s through the 1980s. This title and books by David North, as well as many other important works of Marxism, are available on the Mering Books website. We encourage questions from the audience. We'll be looking at these live and getting them to our panelists. But David, let me ask the first question, and that is, what motivated the decision to finally investigate Trotsky's assassination in 1975, 35 years after it took place?
Can you hear me now? The first point which needs to be made in response to your introduction is, why did it take so long? Trotsky was the founder of the Fourth International, undoubtedly the greatest figure next to Lenin in the history of the socialist movement in the 20th century. His assassination was the most consequential political assassination of the 20th century in terms of its political significance and political consequences for the workers' movement internationally in every country. So why did it take 35 years for this investigation to take place? Now, hopefully we'll get into that and answer it. We'll be able to answer that question. But the circumstances which led to the investigation can be, I think, quite simply summed up. In 1974, it came to the attention of the leadership of the Workers' League that its national secretary at the time, Tim Wolfeth, had entered into a personal relationship with a woman whom, as it subsequently emerged, had high-level family connections with the Central Intelligence Agency. He had not informed the National Committee or the Political Committee of this fact. And when we asked him, when this came to light and asked him why he had not informed us, he said that he thought it was unimportant, it was a purely personal matter, it was no one's business but his own. That explanation was not accepted. After all, if you go back to that period, at that very time in the 1970s, there was an enormous amount of information emerging about the COINTELPRO program, the massive infiltration of the socialist movement by informers working on behalf of the FBI, the CIA. The Socialist Workers' Party itself it was reported, somewhere in the area of 1,000 informants in and out of its organization at some point. It may have had more informants than actual members. It was massively penetrated. Of course, the tragic impact of penetration on the Black Panthers was well known. Many of the murders that took place of leading Black Panther figures were the consequences of FBI penetration. So for the socialists, for Tim Wolfeth to say that this was not important was really shocking. In any event, we proceeded as we had to. We initiated an investigation into this to find out more about the background of his companion. Wolfeth then left the movement. He joined the SWP or rejoined the SWP. And then the leader of the SWP at the time, Joseph Hansen, wrote a denunciation of the actions taken by the Workers' League and the International Committee, declaring that our decision to investigate this breach of our security was paranoia, that this was madness, that no rational or sane group of people would ever countenance investigating such a breach of security. Those who concern themselves with security must be mad, they must be paranoid. And that then raised a historical and political question. After all, Joseph Hansen had been Trotsky's secretary. He had been present in Kiowa Khan when Trotsky was murdered. He knew very well that the murderer himself had penetrated the Trotskyist movement via a personal relationship with Sylvia Ageloff, who was, as far as we knew, just a member of the SWP. How could he say that security was of no consequence? Joe has already pointed out to the many assassinations that had taken place inside the Trotskyist movement of Trotsky's son, of his secretaries. With all that had happened, how was it possible to denounce concern for security in the socialist movement as paranoia? And this is what initiated the decision of the International Committee at its 6th Congress in May 1975 to initiate the investigation. I just want to clarify one point. I was working at that time, I was a relatively young member of the movement. I was working as part of a team assembled by the International Committee. The initiative for the investigation was taken by Jerry Healy, which was not accidental because Jerry Healy was part of a generation who actually experienced, who had been active in Trotskyist politics at the time of Trotsky's assassination. And I worked very closely with the editor at that time of the Workers' Press, Alex Mitchell, who was an outstanding journalist, and worked very much to played a very central role in the initial investigation that was conducted in 1975 and in the preparation of the first report on the assassination, which was entitled How the GPU Murdered Trotsky. And so what was so critical, that work was the first systematic review of the circumstances surrounding the assassination of Trotsky. Bits and pieces were known. For example, Isaac Deutscher had written about the role of Marx Borofsky and also about the role of people like Senin and Well, two brothers, the Sobolevičius brothers, who had been active in organizing the penetration of the Trotskyist movement in Europe. But Security and the Fault International, the essay, How the GPU Murdered Trotsky, brought all of this material together. And it also utilized material that had never before been seen, documents, grand jury transcripts. Actually, grand jury transcripts came later, but it uncovered very, very important documents, transcripts of court hearings that had been held in the 1950s in the United States, which highlighted the role in particular of Marx Borofsky, who was absolutely the key figure in this penetration of the Trotskyist movement in Paris, and directly responsible for the murder of Rudolf Clement, Ignaz Reis, Leon Sedov, and of course, played a major role in the murder of Trotsky himself. So that was the background of this investigation.
David, just to follow up on that, the initial investigation also began to uncover documents exposing the relationship between Hansen, the political leader of the SWP, who you referred to. Were you expecting that, or perhaps it gets to the question that you're raising now? But what was expected when the investigation was launched, and was the material that began to come out, was that surprising to you?
Yes, yes. I mean, when the investigation began, there was a political purpose of the investigation. The main political purpose of the investigation was to educate a new generation, to bring forward the tragic experiences of the 1930s and 1940s, the assassination of Trotsky, as an important lesson which had to be learned. This was the counter-revolution. This is what the counter-revolution did or sought to do to revolutionary movements. And those who are serious about socialist politics, who are serious about the fight for working class power, have to be armed with the lessons of that experience and understand the implications of the political struggle. So the first aim was actually to recapitulate, to gather whatever information that could be gathered about this. It was not expected at the time, I can vouch for that very strongly, that we would find information that in any way implicated the current leadership at that time of the Socialist Workers' Party. Our attitude to Joseph Hansen was that he was the leader of the Pabloid tendency. Obviously, we were hostile to his politics, his opportunism, but it did not occur to us at the time that the material we would discover would implicate him, nor could we possibly have known in advance what his reaction would be, either to the actions we took in relationship to Wolfeth or to the telling of the story of Trotsky's assassination. We could not know this. But in the course of that initial investigation, a document was found in the National Archives of the United States in Washington, D.C. Apparently, at that point, certain archives had been declassified, probably as a consequence of some of the changes that took place as a result of the exposure of COINTELPRO. And there was one document that was discovered, which was a report of a meeting that Joseph Hansen had with representatives of the U.S. government at the American embassy, which was of a very strange character. It involved him establishing contacts with the U.S. government, bringing documents to their attention, handing over what was clearly classified information as far as the Trotskyist movement was concerned, and entering into a relationship with the FBI. At that point, it appeared there was only one document. Subsequent investigations would discover further documents which really recorded a far more extensive relationship, including documents in which, by the way, monitored by J. Edgar Hoover, in which Hansen asks, and I quote, for a contact to whom information can be imparted with impunity. He was setting up a private connection with the FBI. He could never explain why this was done. They were catastrophically incriminating documents, which showed that any idea that this was being done because the SWP was soliciting the support of the FBI in the investigation of Trotsky's death were preposterous. At that very time, the FBI was preparing to prosecute the Socialist Workers' Party. And as Eric pointed out in his study titled Agents, which deals with the prosecution of the SWP, even though the case was built around the SWP's alleged relationship with Leon Trotsky, the person in the SWP who had the closest relationship with Trotsky in Mexico, Joseph Hansen, was not among the 18 who were prosecuted by the US government. They knew who he was. So, no, when we began the investigation, we did not anticipate that it would lead to the discovery of a network which extended into the Socialist Workers' Party and which included, among others, the personal secretary of James Buchanan, Sylvia Franklin, aka Caldwell, maiden name Sylvia Callan.
Thank you, David. I'm sure that we'll want to return to further discussion of the role of the leadership of the SWP, including Hansen. Looks like we're getting some questions like that already from the audience. But first, I'd like to bring in Eric, who's written this very important series on Sylvia Ageloff. Eric, you write that information that you've encountered refutes the 80-year-old unchallenged narrative that Ageloff was an innocent dupe who was used by Mercader to gain access to Trotsky. Why did you begin investigating the role of Sylvia Ageloff? What did you expect to find, and were you surprised?
Well, I think the answer is going to be similar to the answer that Comrade David just gave, because it was not the intent of this investigation to begin with the idea that we were proving any definite conclusion. And in fact, it was only in reading through the transcripts of depositions that were taken by the Mexican authorities in the immediate aftermath of the assassination that we came to learn something that the Socialist Workers' Party had hid from its membership and from the American population, which was that Sylvia Ageloff herself had been charged alongside Mercader by the Mexican authorities with murder. That is not in some sort of ancillary way associated to it, but with the legal charge of premeditated murder. When we began to then try to understand how it was the case that Mexican authorities had reached this conclusion, facts of which we were previously aware began to emerge in a clearer light. And credit really here also has to be given to not only the Mexican authorities who carried out the investigation at the time of the assassination, but also to the Mexican Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Penales, and in particular to a researcher, Martin Gabriel Baron Cruz, who has unfortunately passed away recently. But in a book which he compiled, in which the Institute compiled, for the first time, these depositions, the declarations of those who were involved, were published and made available. And we can return, hopefully later in the discussion, to how it was that those documents were saved. Because in fact, these were not, my understanding is these were documents which actually belonged to the prosecutor, Francisco Cabeza de Vaca. And he actually had to give the documents to his wife, who fled Mexico City after her husband, the prosecutor, was assassinated by the GPU in 1943, in part for deciding to prosecute Ageloff, which was something about which he had received death threats before. Just on the issue of what did we learn, were we surprised? Certainly, but what comes out here, as well as in the broader Security and the Fourth International investigation, is that when one begins to peel away the layer after layer of lies created by the Stalinists and defended by their apologists and their accomplices for decades, one gains a much fuller picture of the events. But not only of the events, but also of the importance for the workers' movement today of the fight for historical truth and for the historical continuity of Trotskyism. Because in one sense, we're dealing with particular facts over the course of a relatively brief period, from July 1938, when Sylvia Ageloff goes to Paris with Ruby Weil, who we can return to later, to the events of the assassination. But in a larger and in a more profound sense, we're turning the floodlights on to the history of the workers' movement and exposing 80 years later the counter-revolutionary character of Stalinism and what it embodied. And that from 1936 to 1939, the Stalinist bureaucracy murdered hundreds and thousands of members of the left opposition, hundreds of thousands. It was a genocidal campaign aimed at eliminating an entire generation of socialists, intellectuals, scientists, artists. Horrific crimes were committed, and the victims themselves were denounced by the Stalinists as social fascists, as agents of Hitler, agents of the Mikado. And Trotsky's death was the culmination, really, of an entire historical period of defeats of the working class, defeats which themselves were prepared by the misleadership and betrayals of Stalinism and of the reformist Second International. And Trotsky and Trotskyism had to be physically eliminated. Great lies had to be created. Immense resources had to be expended. Academics and lawyers and artists were bought off to slander an idea, a political program, and the individual who was its embodiment. But Trotskyism could not be killed. It lives on today in the International Committee of the Fourth International. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The Stalinist parties, which once had millions and millions of members, also no longer exist. The Socialist Workers' Party is essentially defunct, and we will address their role in the course of this discussion. But here we are having this discussion today. And by exposing the role of Sylvia Ageloff, and this, I hope, gets back to the question you asked, we're not only shedding light on what really happened during those 25 months, as important as that is, showing how the GPU killed Trotsky, but we're also here turning the tables on a whole historical epoch in which the objective situation gave the Stalinist lies and falsification enough oxygen to live on. But what this shows, and what this exposure now shows, is that this is a new era. It's the era in which the truth has room to come about, and it's one in which the ideas and principles of Trotskyism are going to be adopted by masses of people as the ideological embodiment of the interests and revolutionary aspirations of the working class. So I think that's more, what we've learned just in broader political terms, though I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about the specific facts as well.
We'd like to get back to some of the specific facts that are revealed in your investigation. Perhaps as an introduction to that, a question which might be addressed to both of you has come in from one of the listeners. They write that they ask if we can elaborate on the situation in Mexico at this time, its relationship to the US and the USSR. Why did it grant Trotsky a visa and asylum, and why did it carry out a serious investigation? Which I think gets to the sort of circumstances of the assassination. Trotsky, of course, was in Mexico at the time, as was Joseph Hansen, who we've referred to as a member of Trotsky's Guard and one of Trotsky's secretaries in Mexico City. And of course, Ramon Mercader and Sylvia Ageloff, who were traveling back and forth between Mexico City and New York during the time, as is documented by Eric's series. But clearly the situation in Mexico plays a central role in the assassination, and the Mexican government in the aftermath of the assassination carried out, as Eric reviews, to the extent that there was an investigation, it was carried out by the Mexican government and Mexican prosecutors. And of course, also, David, you actually traveled to Mexico in the immediate aftermath of the launching of the Security and the Fourth International investigation. In fact, talking to many of those who were involved in the initial investigation, including prominent journalists. I wonder if you could speak about that experience, your travels to Mexico, and in answering this question. And also, Eric, if you can, in the course of discussing this, speak a bit more about what was revealed by the Mexican authorities in the course of their own investigation into the assassination.
Well, for the purpose of the investigation, I made two trips to Mexico. The first in December 1976 with Alex Mitchell, and the second in February 1977 with Harold Robbins, who had been Trotsky's, well, yeah, that's a long time ago. It's Harold sitting on the steps right outside of the entry into Trotsky's study. But there were two trips made, and I recall, first of all, as to the question of Trotsky's experience in Mexico and why he found asylum. This is clearly bound up with the impact of the Mexican Revolution, which is one of the gigantic events of the 20th century. It was a massive struggle involving millions of people, of course, a very bloody struggle against the influence against the puppets of American imperialism. And so the National Democratic Revolution still, resounded in the lives of the Mexican people. And there was an immense sympathy for Trotsky. And that found expression in the very courageous stand that was taken by Lázaro Cárdenas to invite Trotsky to Mexico. And at a very, very critical time when the Norwegian Social Democrats had essentially imprisoned Trotsky and were seeking to prevent him from answering the lies emanating from Moscow. My first experience when I arrived in Mexico, I got on a bus from the airport to go to Mexico City, and I went up to the bus driver and asked him, how do I get to Coyoacán? And he looked at me and said, are you going to see the villa where Trotsky lived? And I said, yes. And he smiled. He said, Trotsky's name was Leon, and he was a lion. And I encountered that again and again when I was in Mexico. The Mexican people rightfully had great pride in the fact that their country had given Trotsky asylum. And there was an immense admiration. And I found this often in the most surprising ways, even among bourgeois, who in some way were associated with the life of Trotsky in Mexico. For example, one of the people I interviewed at that time was the son of Judge Carranca, who had taken Trotsky's deposition after the first assault of May 24th. By that time, he was not alive, but his son was alive. And I went to see his son to see whether that's Carranca. I went to see his son, who lived in this enormous hacienda, guarded. He was obviously quite highly placed. He was himself a judge, but he readily agreed to see me. And one of the things he said to me was that, Trotsky said that my father, he said, Don Leon said that my father was an honorable man. And that was the greatest honor my family could receive, that Don Leon, the great leader of the people, had paid that tribute to my father. So you found enormous respect and devotion to the memory of Leon Trotsky. He's a gigantic figure in the consciousness of the masses of Mexico, and I believe that's true to this day. So the investigation was very, very critical. I must say, though, that many of the documents which now have become available were not available then. And that, of course, was unfortunate. Things which now can be established were not known. But I think that just to stress, one other point I want to make in relationship to the pursuit of this investigation. At that time, there were many people who had experienced this, some in a quite dastardly road. One of the people I met, as a matter of fact, was Mercader's lawyer, Siniceros. He was a lawyer with one client, and if you went into his office, there were no law books. And he was obviously a stooge of the Stalinists. I think he agreed to see us only because he wanted to know what we were doing and to keep track on the activities of the International Committee. There were others. The doctor, unfortunately, I don't have his photo right now, Ottavio Bas, who operated on Trotsky, who spoke about that operation and how he felt at the time, realizing that he was trying hopelessly to save the life of a man whom he considered one of the greatest men alive of his time. So it was a very important experience. But one thing I think needs to be stressed, taking up a point made by Eric, and also in one of the initial questions, one must remember that in 1975-76, when we initiated this investigation, Stalinism was still an immense political power. The Soviet Union existed, mass communist parties existed, and the tabloid organizations, which were then seen as the large Trotskyist movements, falsely, their orientation was entirely toward an adaptation to Stalinism. After all, the tabloids had developed a theory that Stalinism, under the pressure of the masses, could be moved to the left and take power. That was one of their initial theories. One of the reasons, aside from the question of saving certain people from exposure, the political reasons for the hostility which our investigation encountered was that this investigation was exposing the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism and the role it played in blocking and preventing and defeating revolutions, not just in the 1930s, but in the entire post-war period. Keep in mind that the investigation began in 1975 in the aftermath of 1968 in France, when the Communist Party, it could be said, single-handedly saved the bourgeois regime in France. It came in the aftermath of Chile, where the Communist Party had played a central role in betraying the Chilean masses and opening the door for the victory of Pinochet. And at that time, still, the events in Portugal were underway, where the Communist Party was supporting the bourgeois government. And the issue of the succession of the post-Franco era was very much alive in Spain. So there was a great deal at stake in opposing the exposure of Stalinism being made by the International Committee. And I think when you put it in this context, it is perhaps easier to understand why we encountered such bitter opposition to the investigation. It was not just about protecting various agents who obviously don't want to be exposed, but we were exposing an entire political movement of powerful bureaucracies which held state power, powerful political parties which still dominated the workers' movement. And so the Trotsky question and the question of Trotsky's assassination cut across a whole vast range of political interests. And I think placed in that context, one can understand why the investigation had to proceed in the face of such really determined hostility.
These are really important points, David, and I think we need to return to the question as to why security in the Fourth International, the investigation into the assassination of Trotsky, encountered such hostility. I wanted to ask Eric to following from what David said about the work in Mexico City, to tell us a little bit about the investigation that the Mexican authorities took out, because among the things that your series reveals is that it looks like the Mexican police were not taken in by the what you call the poor little Sylvia, presentation of her naivete. So maybe you could speak to that and also discuss some of your key findings on Ageloff.
Yes. Well, first, if I could just respond to a point that David raised, because one element of this, which is very important, is that for a younger generation of socialists who are studying this material, I think we find it very hard to understand, at least initially, how anybody could have ever opposed security in the Fourth International, because I don't want to oversimplify it, but it seems so obvious that a revolutionary movement operating under conditions of censorship and state surveillance, and knowing what we know about COINTELPRO and the role in particular that American imperialism plays in assassinating its opponents all over the world and infiltrating any movements which pose any threat to them. How anybody could have dismissed the investigation that our movement was carrying out. I think the political explanation, which Comrade David just gave for them, and we can return maybe to the question of this infamous platform of shame in 1977, at which prominent figures who called themselves left-wing got together to denounce the International Committee as paranoid, et cetera, for having done its revolutionary duty to investigate the role of agents, is really staggering. And I think now, especially, it becomes very clear that those people who, they don't really exist anymore, at least not in a political sense, but who attempt to deny the significance of security in the Fourth International are, they're just cynical, unimportant people with a subjective axe to grind, and people who are witnessing as I was saying, mass surveillance, the National Security Administration's listening to everybody's phone calls, the role of police violence in this country, for example. It just emerges much more clearly why this investigation is so essential as a historical milestone for the revolutionary movement. All right, now just to get back to your question, for the first thing is you have to understand what the poor little Sylvia myth was. And we try to dedicate some time in part one to analyzing this question. But the myth, first of all, was created by Ageloff herself, and actually by Ramon Mercader, who began to say, and this was what we also learned in the course of the investigation that the Mexican authorities conducted, is that the myth originated out of the mouths of Mercader himself. We now know that in June of 1940, Mercader and Sylvia Ageloff and a number of others the two of them were staying together at the Hotel Pierpont in Brooklyn, where he was receiving instructions from his GPU handlers in preparation for the attack of August 1940. Keep in mind, this was after the failure of the May 24th attack on Trotsky's compound that had failed to wound him. So the myth of poor little Sylvia is the myth that this was an innocent young girl who really was not very political. She was in head over heels in love with Mercader, had never even, because she was so naive, so innocent, so unprepared for the events that took place, she was just being led around by him and could not, by some sort of psychological effect of her love for him, was incapable of recognizing any of the glaring contradictions in his story. Now, when you break down the myth, then the entire interpretation of the events leading up to Trotsky's assassination appears in a very different light. And the Mexican authorities were very aware of the fact that this was someone who had higher advanced education.
Eric, if I could just cut in for a minute, you're talking about breaking down the myth. Could you actually do that for us? Of course, it's impossible. You've written a 4-part series, which is incredibly exhaustive in its detail. But I think, for those listening, it would be helpful if you could. You write, for example, in the essay, you say that remove Ageloff from the chain of events, and there would be no assassination of August 20th, 1940. I mean, what can you just very sort of concisely explain who was Ageloff? What was her background, and what exactly was her role in the years preceding the assassination? What were the main elements of the factual findings that you uncovered in the course of investigating this, her role in this?
Right. Well, that's also the remarkable thing, is that we have a tremendous amount of information that the Mexican authorities didn't have. But a number of the most important aspects of this is, first of all, Ageloff was not a naive, innocent person without a political history. This was someone who came from an extremely political family. As we point out in the first part of the series, her sister Hilda, she came from a wealthy real estate family. Her father, Samuel, was an emigre from Russia. And her sister Hilda, her older sister, in 1931, had actually acquired had acquired permission to travel to the Soviet Union and had somehow managed to arrange for a meeting with Krupskaya, the widow of Lenin, in a period in which that was almost impossible to do. In fact, this article which you're showing makes the point, and we cite it, that journalists from major bourgeois publications tried and failed to get interviews with Krupskaya, but somehow this young woman from Brooklyn is able to secure an interview, and then she appears in the New York Times a couple of months after she gets back. So it's a very well-connected political family. Now, Sylvia Ageloff herself was, as we said, she was not a stupid person by any means, and that's one of the lower, sort of more base elements of the myth. This was actually a very highly intelligent person. This was not a time when it was common for women to get advanced degrees. She graduated from Columbia with a master's, I think, in 1934. She studied under people like Sidney Hook. Yes, and this is her master's thesis, which, interestingly enough, studies the psychological phenomenon of suggestibility, which is the process by which individuals can abandon rational critical thought when they are under the sway or influence of someone who they respect. Now, that is an interesting fact because, of course, that's the entire story about how she defended herself. Oh, she was just so in love with this man she respected. She was way out of her league, and she didn't even stop to ever consider the possibility that he could have been working for the GPU. Now, I don't know. There's not enough time to really get through all the elements, and I'm not even, in answering your question, not even at her decision to take a trip with a Stalinist to Paris for the founding conference of the Fourth International. So maybe we can.
Where she met Mercader and then brought him actually to the conference, the founding conference of the Fourth International, which I found extraordinary actually in reading, that he actually went there and was standing outside as the delegates were meeting, smoking a cigarette and walking because she had brought him there.
Yeah, and
there's a whole pattern in which at every point she brings him into contact with leaders of the Fourth International. Yeah,
and they didn't hold that conference, at the Sorbonne in Paris. They had to arrange it for an incredibly secretive. I mean, it is worth bearing in mind. She gets to Paris in 1938. First of all, she's traveling all over Europe when she's there, which is odd considering that this is, the Munich crisis and Hitler's being appeased by the British and the threat of fascism. This is a Jewish girl from New York, and she decides that this is the time she wants to take a vacation, as she would later tell the House Un-American Activities Committee. But yes, she is always there. And that's especially when you look at 1938. And there was a lot more information also that's come out from FBI files, which were in part released because of the security in the Fourth International investigation initiated in 1975. She is meeting everybody. She never asks him. I mean, I don't know how much you want me to get into it now, but there's just, and people should read the article if you want all the details, but she is always at the right place at the right time. From the standpoint,
flying back and forth from New York to Mexico with thousands of dollars. I mean, some of the details you present, how much money she was spending to get plane tickets at the last moment to fly down to Mexico City when Mercader is having doubts or is going through a crisis in the run up to the assassination.
But if I just could make a point, just again to underscore this, look, even as she's there between June and September, when the conference is held, previous to her arrival, Trotsky's son had been murdered in Mexico. actually in France, in Paris, at the Clinique Mirabeau. Later would emerge that the assassination was set up by Mark Zborowski, whom, by the way, Ageloff met. I had never known that until this work began. Ageloff knew Mark Zborowski. While she's there, in July 1938, Rudolf Clement, the secretary of the Fourth International, is murdered. Horribly. He was abducted, and it was very rapidly assumed that the assassination of Clement was set up through a personal relationship he apparently had with a young man who it was believed was a GPU agent. So these were issues which were known at the time. So there was a tremendous level of fear and nervousness. And that's why the founding Congress was held in secret. Now, what was Ageloff doing in Paris? In all likelihood, given the fact that she was in contact with Ivan Crépeau and other leaders of the Fourth International, she was not on a vacation. She was functioning, as far as anyone in the Trotskyist movement knew, as some sort of courier. She was assisting in the organization of the conference. She was sufficiently experienced. She was obviously believed to be an intelligent person, which she was. And that sort of person, I mean, if people sort of think about it, you're going to a conference. Now, her companion to Europe is a Stalinist. She knows that that person is a Stalinist. And this person, Ruby Weil, is then used to introduce her to Ramon Mercader. Now, if that wasn't going to raise suspicions, what would? How could Ageloff be so naive, given the fact that she's a political person? And again, the reason why the issue of the myth and examining the myth is so important, because you have to believe this myth uncritically in order to buy this story. You have to have an image of Sylvia Ageloff as someone who's clueless. And that was more or less the way she sort of lived in the memory of the Socialist Workers' Party and as it was promoted. But it bears no reality to the real person. I mean, to be blunt, no one could just get an interview with Krupskaya in the Soviet Union in 1931 without permission at the absolutely highest levels. That is, from Stalin himself. The Ageloff family was trusted. Soviet bureaucracy had no fear that the person who was coming to interview Krupskaya, who was obviously from the standpoint of the Soviet state, a key personality, Lenin's widow, they're not just going to let her talk to anybody. They're not going to let her talk to somebody who they fear may be a Trotskyist, who might be used to pass on information or to give them documents critical of Stalin. This was set up. Then
Hilda's article, sorry to interrupt you, but Hilda's article in the New York Times, Hilda Ageloff, when she returns, is praising the Soviet authorities. Yes. She's sort of saying things have gotten better since Lunacharsky's out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as I say, to use an old phrase, it doesn't pass the smell test. The Ageloff family was a political family. Later on, documents given the assessment of Whittaker Chambers, who was in touch with the SWP after the assassination of Trotsky and spoke to them, he himself said, look, there's no question that Sylvia Ageloff was in on the crime. And I just want to make this one other point, because in the course of the investigations we carried out in the 1970s and trying to go back and read through documents, I actually contacted a retired FBI agent who had met Sylvia Ageloff. And I asked him at the time, his name was Griffith. He had actually interviewed at some point James Buchanan, who refused to speak to him. And Griffith, I asked about Sylvia Ageloff, and he just said, look, she was nobody's fool. She knew what was going on. She was nobody's fool. But since it was just him saying it, we didn't write about it. Everybody who knew Sylvia Ageloff who actually knew her, and certainly the Mexican authorities knew her, were of the same opinion.
Well,
So
there's
the entire story was preposterous. I mean, you can't explain Sylvia Ageloff's behavior unless you actually buy into the myth. You cannot accept the alibi she's giving. And if you begin putting together all the information, the Ageloff family, their background, and then the material which was assembled by Eric, they may appear to be small details, but flying back and forth between Mexico and the United States at a time when air travel is very expensive. I think one of the findings Eric made was that it was only, in the middle of 1940 that Pan American introduced air travel service between New York and Mexico. And it cost, in the present day dollars, thousands of dollars. She's going down there back and forth without a problem. SWP leaders, when they went to visit Trotsky, drove in jalopies from New York or from Minneapolis all the way down to Mexico City. She had access to vast amounts of money to go back and forth. And I think Eric might go more into these details, which I think are very, very important.
And Eric, also perhaps you could speak about the evaluation of Whittaker Chambers of Ageloff. I mean, everyone who sort of, made an appraisal, who knew something about these questions, concluded that she was likely an agent.
Well, just on that question, Whittaker Chambers was someone, as David mentioned, who the SWP they did speak to about the assassination and what he would have known. Now, for those who aren't aware, Whittaker Chambers was, although his name would later become much more famous, by 1940 he had left the Communist Party of the United States. He had been, for a period, an agent of the Stalinists in what was called the Ware Group. This was later to come out when he was famously testifying that Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent. But he, in a discussion which is memorialized in what is called the W Memorandum, was told by the SWP about Sylvia Ageloff's potential role. And Chambers responded by saying, basically, I don't know if we have the text from that we can show. If not, I'll just paraphrase. He says, you're telling me that this person has sisters who are political, that they're from a wealthy real estate family in New York, and that she was involved, and she was sort of with Mercader every step of the way. And then he actually laughed because he said, this is the least likely possibility is that she's innocent. He said maybe she didn't know that they were going to kill Trotsky until the very last moment, but whatever she knew, the least likely possibility is that she was not working for the GPU in some form. That was.
I think he says also that no one can live with a GPU agent for two years and not know it.
Right, exactly, and there's a lot. I don't want to jump around chronologically, but there's when I think what's also very important how Ageloff responds when she's back in the United States. Of course, that was after the Mexican authorities' investigation. Her release was secured, as we show in the article, through a fair amount of high-level pressure that was placed on the Mexican authorities, despite the fact that the team of prosecutors and police were arguing vociferously against her release. But when she gets back to the United States, she gives this press release in which she says, first of all, her sister Hilda Ageloff says, as far as we're concerned, that is once Sylvia Ageloff was back in the US, as far as we're concerned, the Ageloff family, case is closed. Now that's an extremely odd and suspicious thing for someone to say about the political movement to which they had ostensibly dedicated the last several years of their lives, especially considering that Ruth, the youngest of the sisters, had been a secretary to Trotsky as well in Mexico City after Trotsky arrived there. That was during the Dewey Commission. But the press release that Sylvia Ageloff gives when she arrives in New York says, I basically have no political connections. Trotsky and Sadova, Trotsky's wife, were friends of mine, and I want nothing more to do with this at all. Now, this was under conditions where the GPU was denying any role in Trotsky's death. And they had created this lie that Mercader, whose name was not known until 1950, due to the work of the famed Mexican criminologist Alfonso Quiroz Cuarón, with the help of Gorkin, I believe. But the position that Sylvia Ageloff took was that she wanted nothing more to do with this, that she was totally innocent. She tells a number of lies in that press release, including the fact that she says the judge completely believed that I was innocent and I never had any idea that Mercader could have been an agent, calling him not by that name, obviously. Both statements were patently false. She had actually had multiple occasions where friends of hers, for example, were asking her, are you sure that this guy's story checks out? And she would always say, yes, I think it's fine. Or I checked with Marguerite Rosemere during the March 1940 incident regarding Mercader's office at the Ermita building, which perhaps we can return to. I don't want to just bounce back and forth between different points, but the evidence that emerges is just overwhelming. And again, that was not sort of, we didn't approach this like prosecutors trying to prove that conclusion. But as we really began to work through this material, so much of it had been gathered through the fight by the International Committee in 1975 and thereafter. The conclusion that she was a GPU agent became unavoidable.
Okay, Eric, and we're getting some questions from listeners that get into the details of the actual events leading up to Trotsky's assassination. Someone has asked about security precautions that may have been taken after the May 24th attempt on Trotsky's life. What sort of efforts were made on Trotsky's behalf? And Trotsky also had his own suspicions, didn't he?
Well, I can answer that. Then there are other details which are very important in relationship to the role of Ageloff, which I think Eric can review, which deal with how Mercader himself probably certainly received the assignment. Because on May 24th, there was this attempt by Siqueiros and his gang, painter David Alfaro Siqueiros, to assassinate Trotsky. And in the aftermath of that event, the Socialist Workers' Party certainly did attempt to fortify the compound. There were people sent down from the SWP. They did a fair amount of work to build up the walls around the villa. Harold Robbins, if I can digress, told me a story that when they built the fortifications, they had turrets in sort of towers, and they had slots open in order to make it possible to fire outside and maneuver somewhat with the rifle. But Harold believed that it was not sufficiently wide enough, so he began to widen the space on the turrets, and Trotsky came by and was wondering why Harold was widening the turrets, and he said, "You're a vandal." And Harold tried to explain. He said, "Look, Comrade Trotsky, I'm actually trying to widen our ability to maneuver with our rifles if we have to fight off an armed attack." Anyway, Trotsky walked off, and a bit later he saw Trotsky come back looking at the turrets, and Trotsky began going up higher, went up higher and began himself to sort of begin to widen it. And Harold saw him and said, "Comrade Trotsky, now you're being a vandal." And Trotsky said, well, Harold, you're right. You're right. You actually need to widen these storets. So they did make efforts. But what was lacking clearly was an investigation and a consideration of who was coming in and out of the villa. And here we come to a very important point. If anyone had asked, of all the people we know who now seem to be, who have access to the villa, is anyone suspicious? It would have been certainly Ramon Mercader or Frank Jackson. I had a meeting with a member of the SWP, Jack Weber, long since deceased. His wife, Sarah Weber, had been down in Kiowa Khan, and she had expressed to her husband her concerns, and they were about Mercader. It's also, I was told by the Mexican reporter, Eduardo Diaz Vargas, who was a very well-known and highly respected reporter in Mexico City at the time, and who had sort of struck up a sort of friendship with Trotsky, and he would go and see Trotsky occasionally, that Trotsky said to him, the last time he saw Trotsky was on the 17th of August, 1940, 3 days before Trotsky was assassinated, and the very day when for the first time Mercader actually went into Trotsky's office for what was called a dress rehearsal. And Trotsky said to Diaz Vargas, if I'm assassinated, it will be by somebody I know, either by somebody who is working in the villa or someone who has walked in, who's been inside the villa. It will be someone who knows me. And Diaz Vargas was very, very taken aback when Trotsky said this. Now, it's also known, and it's reported in the biography written by Deutscher, The Prophet Outcast, the third volume, that after the meeting with Mercader on the 17th of August, Trotsky came out and said he was agitated, and he said, I never want to see this man again. He says he's a Frenchman, but he doesn't behave like a Frenchman. He didn't take off his hat in my office. He sat on my desk. This is not how a Frenchman would behave. Trotsky was, of course, a highly cultured man, had spent years of his life in France, was familiar with the French socialist movement. There was something wrong about Mercader. However, Mercader did have access, and he would never have had access without Sylvia Ageloff. And I think the point, which perhaps Eric can pick up on, is the way in which Mercader received the assignment to kill Trotsky, because I think this is a very, very important element of the story, and in particular in dealing with the role of Sylvia Ageloff. What, even assuming, her complicity, how involved was she in the events that led directly to the attempt of August 20th? And I think perhaps Eric would like to take up the story at this point. Okay.
Well, yes. So as David said, on May 24th, the attack led by Siqueiros failed. Now, the GPU team, which was in Mexico City and which had been tasked by Stalin to carry out this task of assassinating Trotsky, which included Eidingen and also included Mercader's mother, Caridad del Rio, who is the subject of the biography recently published by the Spanish academic Gregorio Lurie. Now, the failure of the attack threw the Stalinist plans for a loop, and they began to look for a plan B, or if they had one already, they then began to implement plan B, which ended up being calling Ramon Mercader to New York City to inform him that and to work with him as to how he was now going to carry out the assassination himself. This involved an extremely high amount of risk for the people who were involved. Their lives were on the line. Failed attempts did not please Stalin. There was the famous case of Spiegelglass, who was killed for failing to find and kill Trotsky. or to organize his assassination. And so in June, Mercader is called back to New York City. Now, I know it gets tough with the chronology to remember where people are. In June 1940, Ageloff was back in New York. She had been in Mexico City earlier that year until March. In fact, the last thing she does before she leaves to go back to New York is she brings Mercader to the Trotsky compound, and actually within the gates of the compound for the first time. Then she flies back to New York. And in June, after the May attack has failed, he meets in the Hotel Pierpont with a number of GPU officials, including Eidingen. And it's there in the hotel room, and while he's staying there, that the plans for the assassination are carried out. Now, we know that Sylvia Ageloff is also staying at the hotel with Mercader. There aren't obviously physical records of written records of these meetings. Yes, that's the hotel building itself in New York City. But what we do know is that Mercader receives there his instructions, and he's profoundly impacted by them. He is deployed back to Mexico City by way of a land crossing instead of flying back with all the resources that the GPU had. They wanted him to cross by foot because I guess the way that the border and customs worked at the time, one's entry wasn't formally noticed if you crossed via train from Texas and then took the train from northern Mexico to Mexico City. But he takes a very long time getting back to Mexico City. It's actually Sylvia Ageloff who helps him arrange this very complicated travel plan back to Mexico City. And there's a lot of concern among the GPU because Mercader begins to act very strangely. And this is recorded in Deutscher as well. Mercader begins to lose his cool. He's acting very erratically. He's acting like someone who has just been given an extremely difficult task. And if he fails, that he and his mother and his family will face retribution for it. And it takes weeks and weeks go by. Mercader returns at the end of June to Mexico City, but July passes and August begins, and he still hasn't carried out the attack. There's a telegram which he receives in early August saying, "Return to New York at once." And this is a message that he undoubtedly received from his GPU handlers. He doesn't return. It's not entirely clear what day he receives this, but Sylvia Ageloff decides immediately to drop everything. This is someone who's already taken months and months off of her job in the middle of the Depression. She is acting like she's not very concerned about losing her job as a public servant in New York City. She drops everything. She travels, as David already indicated, on this brand new line called the Mexico Flyer. She travels day and night. It's like a 20-hour trip. It lands and takes off to refuel, 5 or 6 times all the way down the Atlantic coast. And then she gets to Mexico City, and basically the first thing that she does is she moves Mercader into a new hotel. They're together at the Hotel Montejo, and I believe we have a photo of that hotel as well. That's where they are as they in the 10 days before the attack, and 10 days after Sylvia Ageloff arrives, the deed is carried out. And she's the one in these last days who not only, it appears, is more handling, and there's still questions about exactly how everything worked out, but it does look from the record that she's the one who's more handling Mercader than the other way around. And when she actually brings, and Sedova says this is another very important aspect, and then I'll stop if there are other questions, but Sylvia Ageloff tells Trotsky's wife, with whom she was personally on a friendly basis with, and tells Sedova that Mercader has proposed to her and that they're married. And this is used basically as the wedge get Mercader into the House. As David indicated, Trotsky was growing incredibly displeased with this man who was obviously hiding something, and yet it was this fact of their marriage that Sylvia Ageloff had introduced that allows him to enter not once but twice alone with Trotsky.
I think that these details are incredibly significant. I think, for anyone, who didn't go through the initial investigation and have direct sort of involvement, when you read this, it's very clear. You can't get 10 pages into Eric's essay without concluding she was a GPU agent. The facts are just so striking, and I think the same is true when looking at the material in the initial investigation of Security in the Fourth International on the role of Joseph Hansen, his meetings with the FBI. You read the facts, and it comes out very clearly what the conclusions are. I think there's two questions which arise out of that, which perhaps we could shift to. One is one that many of our listeners are asking that if you could speak on, and that is why, again, was there not an investigation carried out by the Socialist Workers' Party and the Trotskyist movement, or a serious investigation in the aftermath of the assassination? What explains the 35 years before the investigation was carried out? Many people are raising that question. I think a related or separate question, but raises similar issues, is the response again from the pseudo-left tabloid organizations. There was reference that Eric made to the platform of shame, which I think we perhaps David could speak about. But why this sort of what sort of politically explains this really vociferous reaction against and denunciation of the investigation that we were carrying out when the facts were so clear? I think those two sort of issues arise after you begin sort of looking at the details of this case.
Well, I'd like to address that. First of all, I just think it's important. There's various levels upon which you can explain these events. Of course, you're dealing with individuals and people, and that can't be avoided. And no doubt, there were many mistakes made by the Socialist Workers' Party in relationship to Trotsky's security. But I think it's critical to place the event within its appropriate historical context. Trotsky himself had said that he saw his life within the framework of the vicissitudes of the social revolution, its rise and its fall. In 1917, he, you might say, was swept up by massive social forces and led with Lenin the greatest revolution in world history. Within several years, as he explained so brilliantly in his autobiography and in so many of his political writings, he began to lose power. He said at one point, losing power isn't like losing a watch. Losing power expresses a change in social relationships and the relationship of forces. Trotsky's fate was bound up with the most catastrophic defeats of the working class in the 20s and particularly in the 30s, the rise to power of fascism in Germany, the catastrophe of Popular Front politics in France and in Spain, the outbreak of World War. All of these, of course, created conditions in which Trotsky was immensely isolated and the revolutionary forces were under siege with limited resources. There were little margins for error. Why did, for example, Hilda Ageloff have access to Trotsky? Well, she spoke Russian. So did Sylvia Ageloff. And Trotsky was constantly desperate for secretarial assistance. Trotsky did a great deal of his writings through dictation. He dictated in Russian. He had Russian typists or people who were proficient in Russian typing. They had to type very quickly. There were a limited number of people who were available. And so anyone who had this skill could volunteer. And certainly, if I can be blunt, the Ageloffs, Hilda and Sylvia Ageloff both made use of that need which Trotsky had in his secretariat to infiltrate and to have access. So I think it's very important to recognize the objective conditions. That does not absolve the SWP from its political mistakes. The fact is, for whatever reason, and I think it grows darker and more complicated as the years go on, they chose not to investigate the issue of Sylvia Ageloff. Cannon made a speech after Trotsky's death where he says, I think at the next convention of the SWP, we didn't pay enough attention to people's personal connections, and in the future we will. Well, they didn't. At that very time, his own personal secretary, Sylvia Caldwell, that was her name, was a Stalinist agent, and every document that Cannon had access to would eventually be read by Stalin. She took everything, copied everything, handed it over to Lucy Booker, who lived a few blocks away from the SWP's office. She was part of this espionage ring led by the Soblin brothers. Now, if we move forward into the period of the securing the Fourth International investigation, I think there are two factors which are very, very critical here. First of all, as I've explained earlier, Stalinism was still a very potent force, and it had major reasons why it did not want an investigation into the crimes of the GPU. That was a serious political issue to expose the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism. But there's another factor. And it also, in terms of the personnel and the type of forces attracted to the Pabloite movement, and I would say as someone who experienced that, it was really shocking because we were discovering these extraordinary documents, which, I mean, and it might come as a surprise, far from sort of jumping to the conclusion that there are agents. In fact, the initial demand of the International Committee, when these documents first began to emerge, we asked for a parity commission, for a commission of inquiry composed of an equal number of people from the Pabloite movement and from the International Committee to investigate these issues of security. Now, what was so striking about this was their response. And there were two intersecting factors. One, no doubt, the role of agents inside their organization who were determined to block any investigation. But the other element was the cynicism and indifference which we encountered among members of the SWP themselves. I cannot tell you the number of times I would encounter members of the SWP and try to talk to them about securing the Fourth International, and they would giggle and they would laugh and they thought it was a big joke, and who cares? See, the SWP and the Pabloite movements were not recruiting people on the basis of a revolutionary program. They were oriented to the Democratic Party. They were oriented to various other middle-class movements. That was Pabloite politics. And so the line one heard again and again was, agents do good work. Where this came from, this became their line. Who cares if there are agents? They do good work. They'll help the movement. They'll do other work. Well, what was the good work they had done? Zborowski had murdered Trotsky's son. He had murdered Rudolf Clement. He set up the assassination of Erwin Wolf and Ignaz Reich. And when he came to the United States in 1941, with the help of George Novak and Lola Dolan, he continued his spying operations against the Trotskyist movement. Hansen himself, the one leading member of the SWP who miraculously escaped prosecution in 1941 by the US government in a case which was centered on proving the connection between the SWP and Trotsky, he was left out of it. He goes on to become a leading figure of the Socialist Workers' Party and pursuing politics which were really antithetical to the interests of the development of a revolutionary movement. I'm not going to get into all the other issues which came up about the SWP itself, high-level penetration. Its vice presidential candidate was later exposed as having been an FBI agent, things that came out in the 70s. But it was the at that time, the staggering indifference. And that was rooted in the political orientation of the SWP and the type of people they were recruiting. And it became clear that, I said at the time that if we would produce a picture of, Joseph Hansen getting the Congressional Medal of Honor from the United States Congress or the Stalin Prize from the Soviet Union, the reaction would be the same. They would say something like, well, are you happy now? Who cares? Doesn't really matter. I think we're in another period now. I think what's happening in the United States, what's happening all over the world, the growth of fascistic movements, the fact that we've just witnessed an assault which shows how fragile the entire political system is in this country, I think is going to produce a different orientation as the working class is politically radicalized. And I can also see from the type of response we're getting now is far, far different from what it was in the 1970s and 1980s. I see the enormous interest of younger people. And again, one of the questions I think Eric's indicated I get is younger people find it difficult to understand why this investigation was opposed. What's the problem? But it was a problem then. And just finally, the point you raised about the infamous platform of shame meeting, which was correctly named by the International Committee. The whole leadership of the Pale White movement, chaired by Tariq Ali in London, they held that meeting, not just to defend Hansen, but specifically to defend Sylvia Caldwell, the private secretary.
We have a photo here, I believe.
Yes, that picture is a very interesting photograph. I have to tell you something about it. This meeting was called in London on the 14th of January, 1977 at Friends Hall in London. Jerry told me that was the second time he had gone to a meeting at Friends Hall. The first time had occurred exactly about 30 years earlier when he had just joined the Trotskyist movement, and he went to a public meeting of the Communist Party and raised a question about the Moscow trials and was physically thrown out of the room. This time, a meeting was called in defense, basically in defense of agents inside the Trotskyist movement. Jerry Healy went to that meeting. There were 2,000 members of all the associated tabloid organizations there. He went, his entire entourage consisted of 3 people, himself, one security person and his secretary. And after he had been denounced for 2 hours by George Novak, Ernst Mandel, Pierre Lambert, Tariq Ali, Tim Wolfeth, he just got up and raised his hand to ask a question, and he was not allowed to speak. He was just going to raise a question and say, well, it's all interesting what you said. Why don't you agree to a parity commission to review the evidence? They wouldn't allow that, and he was not allowed to speak. But that, all the people they were defending have since been exposed comprehensively as agents. So I think if we look at this in a broader historical context, history moves at its own pace. What we see in this is a change in historical conditions. This is a period, however complicated the situation may appear to be, there are powerful forces working toward social revolution in our epoch. There's a great crisis of leadership. It's a great problem in the development of political consciousness. But if one's a materialist, and if one believes that, historical, as Trotsky said, historical necessity cuts a path to the consciousness of the masses. The task of the revolutionary movement is to facilitate that process. And I think explaining historical questions, including the most tragic experiences of our movement, is a critical part of the development of the consciousness of the working class. And if the work which was done by the older generation on security and the ongoing work raises the consciousness of the most advanced sections of workers, of youth, of intellectuals, those who are being drawn to the socialist movement and who can now respond to these dangers in a way which was perhaps not possible because of the unfavorable conditions of an earlier period, well, I think securing the Fourth International really justifies itself. And I would urge younger comrades, those who are joining and becoming active in revolutionary socialist politics to very, very, very seriously study this material and draw the lessons. It's not a matter of in any way creating panic and fear. That's not ever the appropriate political response. Use knowledge, develop procedures which enable the movement to examine the forces that come into the movement. Take a critical attitude, incorporate into your understanding of revolutionary politics the simple fact that, yes, the state will seek to infiltrate the movement, but the state's not all powerful. The Marxist movement has its own resources, and it has the resources of political consciousness and immense experience. And so, reviewing this, it's now nearly a half century since Securing the Failed International began. I think that is the knowledge which has been accumulated is a immense treasure for the working class movement, for the socialist movement, and I'm confident that the younger generation of working people will make use of it.
The comments David just made, the Smith Act trial came up, and as David said, Hansen alone among the SWP leadership was not charged, and that raises a question that came from the audience: was there no suspicion of Hansen in these years? And Eric, we have a question also on HUAC. If you could discuss, you should probably explain what HUAC was and the role that Ageloff's testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee played in this case.
Yes, well, in 1950, the House Un-American Activities Committee convened a special series of investigations into the American aspects of the assassination of Leon Trotsky. Now, obviously, the anti-communists who were running the HUAC were not interested in getting to the truth of the death of Trotsky. They, of course, were themselves very glad that the assassination had been carried out. In fact, the Roosevelt administration wouldn't even allow Trotsky's remains to enter into the United States for fear of the demonstrations that would take place, and that his ashes would then lay somewhere in the United States where they could become a mobilization point for socialists. But at the end of 1950, in December, the committee called Sylvia Ageloff and Hilda Ageloff and Ruby Weil to appear. This was in early December. We know that these public appearances were prepared by extensive research and questioning by the committee, by the congressmen, their staff, their attorneys. We know this because of statements that came out. Ruby Weil acknowledged that she'd been speaking and that they'd been speaking to government officials for quite a while in the lead up to the hearing itself. And then in early December, they convened a hearing that only lasted about 90 minutes, or might have even been somewhat less, in which the Hilda and Sylvia Ageloff essentially restated what had already been known, that they were innocent victims, that Sylvia Ageloff was in love with Mercader, that she had been used by him, etc. The FBI and the American intelligence agencies and the HUAC itself were, of course, not interested in hearing her recapitulate this lie, which had already been stated publicly on many occasions. But very interestingly, at the end of the printed report or the executive summary, actually, I think it was at the beginning of the printed report that the committee put out after the testimony, they go out of their way. There were about 11 or 12 GPU people who were involved in this questioning. There was other hearings that addressed somewhat different aspects of the process, but the committee only thanked 2 of the people who gave testimony, and that was Sylvia Ageloff and Hilda Ageloff. They specifically thanked them for giving valuable information. And that was not the information that was given in the public testimony, because that wasn't valuable. It didn't mean anything. They had evidently given information to the committee, which it found extremely useful. And that could have only really been information about other GPU agents in the United States. And that was really what they were after. And the committee even said that they were aware many people had said that the Ageloff sisters were involved, and that the Ageloffs were faced tremendous political danger, or I think they say at one point physical danger, for agreeing to testify. That obviously wasn't from the SWP, which didn't even send a reporter to cover the testimony. But just as later in the 1950s and early 60s, they were not to send reporters to cover when Zborowski was arrested, when the Sobolev brothers were arrested. So it was another very significant revelation that is included in our essay. Obviously, there's a huge amount that we don't have time to cover. I would encourage people to go to the World Socialist website and read the series. By the way, I believe today is the 23rd birthday of the World Socialist website, if I'm not mistaken, on February 14th, 1998. But just lastly, on the points that David was raising, the Trotskyist movement and really socialism in the 21st century is based on the principle of the fight for the political independence of the working class from the bourgeoisie, the capitalist parties, and all of their political representatives. That's an essential element of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And the physical independence of the workers' movement from the agents of the state is also a central element of that. And so for us, it isn't possible to separate the political fight for the independence of the working class with the right of the party and its obligation to keep itself independent of all those who work for the state and come in. I mean, lastly, when David recalls the SWP and people on the platform of shame and the line that agents do good work, I mean, what can one do aside from scratch your head at these people? They obviously have nothing to do with socialist politics or left-wing politics. And it's certainly something that an agent would say to try and protect their cover. But anyway, I'll leave my contribution there.
Well, they do good work for the counter-revolution and for the state, but not for socialism. We're going to have to begin drawing this very fascinating discussion to a conclusion. I do want to, though, allow both of you to speak again on a broader significance, and perhaps to introduce that. I just was rereading the introduction to How the GPU Murdered Trotsky, which was published by the International Committee of the Fourth International, and the introduction in 1981, and that brought together many of the documents in the initial security in the Fourth International investigation. And at the ICFI wrote that the exposure and political destruction of these agents, along with their accomplices in revisionist organizations in every part of the world, is the supreme responsibility of the International Committee. The issue here is not vengeance for Trotsky's death. The essence of security in the Fourth International is the struggle for working class power. Can you elaborate on that point? Why security in the Fourth International is so central, or the issues it raised are so central to the development of a working class revolutionary socialist movement then and today?
Well, David, maybe you want me to go first so that you can bring the meeting to an end. But I would just again refer back to the same book which Joe has just cited, because there's a section in which we make the point. I'll just read a couple of sentences from it. That security in the Fourth International represents nothing less than the reclamation of the whole historical continuity of Bolshevism through the Fourth International and the International Committee from the evil grip of Stalinist counter-revolution and falsification. All the lies and distortions and crimes committed by Stalinism against Trotskyism, the political embodiment of the struggle for the World October, all the monstrous acts committed to confuse and disorient generations of workers about the real history of the October Revolution and the role of Trotsky, these have been dealt a blow from which Stalinism and all the agencies of imperialist counter-revolution will never recover. And they didn't ever recover, actually. And this is a tremendous fact, not only about what can be, about the significance of this investigation, but a lesson as well about what can be accomplished by the movement when it sets itself out to oppose and expose such incredibly powerful, once seemingly invincible, that wouldn't be the right word, but the tremendous power of the Soviet bureaucracy or the American state. So for us, and another point which is stressed by the International Committee as it conducted this investigation itself was that while, of course, the exposure, and I really want to encourage you, if you're new to socialist politics, if you're a newer member of the Socialist Equality Party, really go back and read how the GPU murdered Trotsky. Read the books on the Gelfand case. There's also Agents, the book from 2019, which should be read. And as well as, I mean, it's not even possible here to read out all the books that should be read, but because what we're not just dealing with a forensic exercise, we're dealing with a fight to tie the work of the party, the work of the International Committee on a daily basis as we engage in strikes and social struggles and as we build the party, we're always consciously striving to do it in the traditions of the movement. The book that Comrade David wrote about the split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party was called The Heritage We Defend. And what is so striking about the security in the Fourth International is that it is something which brings together and ties together as the thread that connects our work today to all of the significant episodes of the fight for socialism over the course of the 20th century, dating back to the October Revolution, the founding of the left opposition by Trotsky in 1923, the call for and the eventual establishment of the Fourth International, the split in 1953 and the establishment of the International Committee. And it's throughout this that the fight for historical truth, the fight to expose the role that agents played in carrying out what we've characterized as the most consequential assassination of the 20th century. This is the basis upon which we approach this question. And I would just say lastly that it's this attention to history which is absolutely necessary for the development of a revolutionary movement in the world today. And those of you who are learning about socialism, who are interested in it, this is a world of 7 billion people. It is a world of thousands and thousands of political parties. But there's only one political movement which represents the interests of the international working class and which strives to bring into its activity and its daily work the highest possible level of historical understanding, to give the working class this understanding of its own history, because that's what this is. And on the basis of that, to lead the working class to establish a new world based on socialism, based on equality, and based on the abolition of capitalism.
Well, I would only add, I think Eric has very, very well summed up the issues. I'll just add a few points or underscore a few points. First of all, Rosa Luxemburg once said that the most powerful weapon which the working class has is its history, understanding its history. She referred to history as the Via Dolorosa of the working class. All its experiences, tragedies have been recorded. Marx said something similar. He said bourgeois revolutions are set in brilliance, but the working class movement, the revolutionary movement of the working class, is a much more complicated and difficult process. And of course, that has been proven the case by history. But the past counts and the history counts, and that is, it has to be incorporated each day into our evaluation of events, the way we understand history, the way we understand the present. I mean, to work in the present without a broad historical framework is to work without a compass, is to work on the basis of impressions. Because what are impressions? They are random thoughts produced without relationship to the process out of which they arose. Now, the assassination of Trotsky was the high point of the counter-revolution that followed the October Revolution. It was prepared on the basis of lies, falsifications of Trotsky's role. It began with the lie that Trotsky underestimates the peasantry, lies about Trotsky's relationship to the October Revolution and to Bolshevism, lies about the theory of permanent revolution. And of course, all of these were ultimately related to very fundamental questions. Because what was Stalinism in the end? It was the subordination of the working class to the politics of world imperialism. Now, these issues are alive today as they were in the 1930s. What's the issue today? Establishing the political independence of the working class. Fighting to free the working class from the political stranglehold of the bourgeois parties and their agencies. And Trotskyism, the Marxism of the 20th and now the 21st century, builds on this vast historical experience. If I can refer to something I wrote, I made the point, and I think in defensively on Trotsky, that the moment one speaks about Trotsky, one's not just speaking about the past, one's speaking about the present. One's attitude to Trotsky's life and work not only reveals one's attitude to the Russian Revolution, but one's attitude to day-to-day politics. And that's understood, that's well known. Our movement internationally is the only movement in every country which stands up for the political independence of the working class, which draws on the lessons of the October Revolution, which upholds the basic conception that socialist consciousness must be brought into the working class. And of course, essential to socialist consciousness is consciousness and awareness of its history. Now, we are at a point where, however complicated the process, revolutionary issues are again being posed. And I think under these conditions, all the work of securing the Fourth International will acquire fresh significance. Yes, it will begin to appear to large numbers of working people that these truths and these facts, which were so hard to uncover, they'll appear as clear as day. Obviously, the International Committee was correct, and we were correct. There is nothing which we need to take back 45 years after the investigation began. And the basic political premises, after all, have been verified. Was Stalinism counter-revolutionary? Yes. Did Stalinism lead to the liquidation of the Soviet Union, as Trotsky warned? Yes. It proved to be the principal agency of imperialism. And all those forces which defended Stalinism in one way or another apologized for its crimes, which include the liberals, which would then turn to anti-communism, or the Pavlovites, which said that it was necessary to build independent revolutionary parties of the working class. They've all been disproven and discredited. And it just happens to be the case that the movement that fought for history, fought to uncover the tragic lessons of experiences of the past, to make the facts known, proved to be the only movement that could actually sustain and develop into the new period the program and perspective of Marxism. So I think, looking back over 45 years, I'd just like to end with one last point. When we began the investigation, and I would speak to older members of the SWP, some of them, and I'm talking about the really older members, they would say, why are you raising this? This happened so long ago. Or someone said, I can't, you're asking me about something that happened 35 years ago. I can't remember. Well, let me tell you something from my standpoint, and I'm saying this to young people, 35 years, that's nothing. Important events stay with you forever. What happened, sometimes it really is true. You can remember what happened 35 years ago better than you can remember where you placed your car keys. Those events are not forgotten. The assassination of Trotsky. Now, a greater period of time has passed since the initiation of securing the fall of the National and the 35 years between the death of Trotsky and the assassination of Trotsky and the beginning of the investigation. 45 years is nothing. 35 years was a short period of time. If it was not studied, it was for two reasons. One, the objective forces were very powerful, suppressing the development of the Trotskyist movement. And then there were people who just didn't want to know. There's one very fine statement written about Jim Cannon after Jim Cannon had conducted this correspondence with the historian Theodore Draper. It was published as a book called The First 10 Years of American Communism. And Draper, in commenting on Cannon's letter, said that if Cannon remembers the past, it's because he wanted to remember. A lot of people at that time didn't want to remember. They didn't want to talk about it, either because they had things to hide or because they had abandoned a revolutionary orientation. They had made their peace with bourgeois society. They had adapted to the post-war boom, to the political organization, and they wanted out of it. And among the more cynical would be those who said, well, you could be right, but it all happened so long ago. Why bring it up now? That was never our attitude. That's never the attitude of revolutionaries. The revolutionary movement forgets nothing. It carries its history on its back, and it utilizes that history to educate the working class and prepare it for the present day tasks, which are of a revolutionary character. So I hope that this discussion has been informative. I can assure you that we will hold meetings on these questions. We will publish material, continue to publish material as material arises. And finally, the audience for this, as we can see now, it's a worldwide audience, people listening from all over the world. I am sure that this material will make its way and enter into the consciousness of ever broader sections of workers and people committed to the fight for socialism.
Thank you, David. And a couple more thank yous before handing it over to Joe for a brief summation. So thank you to our audience. As David mentioned, from all over the world, we're sorry that we weren't able to get to all of your many fascinating questions. And of course, thank you to our two speakers, David North and Eric London. We mentioned a couple of their books in defense of Leon Trotsky, and Eric's book, Agents, the FBI and GPU, Infiltration of the Trotskyist Movement. These and many other titles are available at Mering Books. That's www.mering.com. And we very much encourage you to go visit that site and make a selection. So again, thank you all, and let me turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Tom. I'm not intending to do any sort of summation. I think that the comments from Eric and David were both excellent in summing up the issues. I would just note that this has been a meeting which has been focused on critical, essential issues of history, the history of the Trotskyist movement, security in the Fourth International. Of course, we're holding this meeting under conditions of an intensifying economic, social, political crisis, the pandemic, which has killed millions, has killed nearly 500,000 here in the United States, a political crisis unlike anything that has been seen. We've seen the developments over the past several weeks, the emergence of fascism as a dominant political force in America, and this is a global process. And it's under these conditions that there's a growing movement of workers all over the world. For socialism, there's a growing audience for socialism. I think the issues that we've been addressing here on the significance of history the really necessity to base a socialist movement on the experiences of history, on the bringing forward of this historical experience into the development of a movement in the working class. That is the task of a party. I would just make 2 points in concluding. First, I want to urge everyone who's watching this, make a donation to the World Socialist website. Eric noted it's the 23rd anniversary. Well, it's in fact now the halfway point. If he goes back 23 more years to 1975 and the initial decision to launch the Security and the Fourth International, 23 years between then and the founding of the World Socialist website, and 23 years of the World Socialist website itself. It's been 23 years of unending, continuous daily coverage of world developments, the essential resource for the working class. You can go to the website, by the way, click on the essay by Eric at the very top of the page, read it, and then there's also other material that you can access on Security and the Fourth International, other documents, an important series of interviews carried out with David North several years ago, which dealt with some of these issues in greater detail. It's an incredible resource, the World Socialist website. Please, right now, if you're watching this, go to wsws.org/donate and make a donation. The World Socialist website is subject to endless censorship, and we need your assistance. We're nearly all the way through on the New Year fund appeal for the World Socialist website, but we need still some resources, and the donation that you make will be essential in providing the foundation for the website to grow, to expand, to reach ever broader sections of the working class, and to have more meetings like this. A second point is go to make decision to join the Socialist Equality Party, our sister parties throughout the world. There should be a button on the side if you're watching at wsws.org/live, or go to this URL, wsws.org/join. A socialist movement must be built, but that requires that people take action and make the decision to build it. So I urge all of you listening today to make that decision and join the SEP, wsws.org/join. And that brings our meeting to a conclusion. I want to again thank David, Eric, for your excellent statements, and thank you to all of you who have been listening in today.